All right, so can everybody hear me okay? On Zoom? A thumbs up?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. All right. Okay. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm still waiting for a couple people in person, so I'm gonna just get this going and then step out. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you Maggie for coming and presenting for us on capital improvement projects and how to prepare for them. I did want to mention that the training is being partially funded through our grant that we've received through the USDA, and it's the Rural Community Development Initiative grant. And I will be sending out the PowerPoint to you here in just a few minutes as well, so you'll have that handy for those of you on Zoom, and you have a print version there. And then I'll be recording the session as well. And as far as questions, I think it's just going to be pretty much, if you have a question, ask it as we go. If you want to raise your hand on the Zoom, feel free, or put it in the chat. I'll be checking that as we go as well. So I'm going to let Maggie go ahead and get started.
Okay, I'm gonna move this because I don't have a clicker. So I'm gonna walk over here and use this.
Oh, shoot.
No,
I forgot
that's
to
okay.
get the clicker.
That's okay, because remember, like, that's way too technology advanced for us.
Totally
The
forgot.
clicker is not
Bill is
needed.
not here. We might have had-
We were worried about our technology abilities at 5 o'clock at night
Yeah.
without the smart
Yeah,
young
I
people
have
in the
Bill
room.
on speed dial, it's fine.
So I'm Maggie Burger with Speer Financial. We're just gonna get started. I've shut our camera off because I like to walk around and use my hands, and you will all get, if you're zooming in, you will get dizzy with that. So we'll go ahead and just get started here. Our agenda this evening, we're gonna do a small introduction. We're gonna talk about general city finance overview, capital improvement planning, the budget constraints, enterprise funds, and cash balances. You know, the title is capital improvements planning, but all of these things go into capital improvements planning. These are all things you have to be aware of, talking about, thinking about as you're preparing those capital improvements plans. Go ahead, if you're online and you want to stop me with anything, you can either raise a hand, you can just interrupt, just, you know, click your mic on and interrupt me. That is just fine. So again, I'm Maggie Burger. I'm a senior vice president with Speer Financial. We have an office located in Waterloo, Iowa, and I'm in that office and represent cities, counties, school districts, and community colleges across the state of Iowa. I am a part of the National Association of Municipal Advisors, and after doing my job for 15 years, there was federal regulation implemented with the Dodd-Frank Act, and I had to become a qualified municipal advisor representative and a principal of my company. So I had to take 2 tests. They were standardized. They were like 200 questions. It was horrible after being out of college for like 20 years to study for those. I have a bachelor's of arts degree from Loras College in finance. So right here in the Dubuque area. And I've been with Speer Financial for 19 years. So again, we cover the whole state of Iowa. We also have an office in Illinois, in our Chicago office. They cover all the state of Iowa. We don't let them come. They cover all of Illinois. We don't let them come into Iowa. So we're going to talk a little bit first about general finance overview. And here is my atom bomb explosion, House File 718, right? So over a year and a half ago, that one rocked our world. And so this is really why it becomes important to talk about capital improvement planning, because we understand everybody's budgets are going to get tighter for the next 2 to 3 years. And we assume coming out of 28, 29, that the legislature is going to somehow get creative in the next 2 to 3 years. And where your last year of this little House File 718 is supposed to end, we just don't feel like that's going to happen. We think there could be other constraints coming, and so we definitely want to talk through that and do a little planning here. So first of all, we're going to talk about debt capacity, because again, as we talk about doing and participating with the idea of capital improvements planning, which doesn't always have to be a borrowing, we have a debt capacity calculation we need to do. So I remind everybody that debt capacity is 5% of your 100% actual valuation. You are using regular and agriculture in that. What counts against debt capacity is the total principal only of general obligation, local option sales tax revenue debt, and TIF revenue debt counts against your debt capacity. We've got total aggregate amount of rebates that counts against if there's not annual appropriation language. If you have rebate agreements in TIF that are annually appropriated, you only have to count the amount annually that you are rebating back. So in that year 1 or year 2 of that rebate agreement, when you're not rebating anything back because there's no new valuation, you don't even count anything. But if I had an agreement that said, did not have annual appropriation language, and there was $100,000 of rebates over a 10-year period, about $10,000 a year, I'd have to count all 100,000 against that debt capacity. So annual appropriations is very safe for the city to do that. I've got a calculation up there, $109 million of valuation, actual valuation, 5%, that's about $5.4 million of debt capacity. Total general obligation debt outstanding for this city, no rebates. Total GO outstanding is about 4.2 million. That gives us remaining debt capacity of about 1,217,000 or approximately 22%. I always say debt capacity should be looked at. It should be reviewed on an annual basis because why? Valuations change annually, as well as your debt repayment or debt incurrence. You're either taking on debt, you're not, you're paying off debt. The other thing that we like to talk about is most cities tell us, and it's really our recommendation, that you don't really get yourself into a position where you're borrowing more than 80% of your total debt capacity. That just gives you a little bit of cushion because we all know things happen and those things happening are not always bad. It's not, there's a water main break downtown and we need quick money. It's, hey, this company called and they've now decided they're gonna come and build with us. And so those are things that you wanna make sure you have debt capacity for. Talk a little bit about general obligation bonds, because again, this is one of the ways that you can pay for capital improvement projects. General obligation bonds, full faith and credit, at the very least, I say, you have to use debt service levy. You do not have to pay a general obligation bond with debt service levy. You always can say, well, we've got this other source of revenue to pay part of that payment with. It is gonna be, a GO bond is gonna be your lowest cost of issuance for any type of debt issuance that you do in the market. It's gonna have the lowest interest rates. You can have a maturity up to 20 years on a GO debt in the state of Iowa. There are things like essential corporate purposes, which require public hearings only. And there are items like general corporate purposes. Those are items, and we'll go through this list on the next page, but those items sometimes require a referendum for approval. If they do require a referendum, it is a 60% super majority. And I always say this, multiple issuances can be done from one referendum. You guys are a lot of cities, but if you think about a school district, they put a very large bond issue on a ballot and they want you to vote on that. Typically, they're not issuing one bond issue for that. A lot of times if they're building a new school, just because of the spend down, they're maybe issuing 2 or 3 times. Community colleges do the same things. There's no limitation to the debt service levy rate in Iowa. And I say that now, that is a fear of mine that the legislature is gonna come in and start doing some kind of restrictions on that. But right now, as long as you stay within your debt capacity, you can levy the debt service applicable to the debt that you've issued without any kind of restrictions in that debt service levy rate. So a few other financing notes here. The debt service levy is an unlimited levy pre and post House File 718. And I put that in there because we've had some cities say, oh, I'm limited to what my debt service levy could be. Now, some cities have put into place their own restrictions. We have a couple of larger cities that we work with who say, we're not gonna have a debt service levy over $3.50. Well, $3.50 in their world generates like $4 million, right? Mm-hmm. So they can pay all of their debt with that. That's not a problem. So there are some limitations like that. General obligation bonds can be abated by other sources of revenue. So every year when you're preparing that budget, you can decide we're gonna use some local option. Maybe we're gonna use some water and sewer because the original debt issued had some water and sewer projects within it. Bond election date is only now at the regular November election. So if you have to put a GO bond on the ballot, it's gonna have to be at that November election. This year, because it was a federal election year, that deadline to putting that on the ballot was August 27th. So it was really early to be able to get that information in. Your new budget deadline, you are all aware, is April 30th of every year. But I want to point out the bond election date for GO bonds is November only. I did do some clarification right after House File 718 was passed. You can put on hotel motel tax elections. You can put on local option sales tax elections. Things like that can all be done at those other dates, that March date, that September date, and that November date. So those are dates that you can utilize for that. It's just that the GO bonds are November only at this point in time. Some of our essential corporate purposes or ECPs are water, sewer, stormwater, streets, sidewalks, police and fire equipment. So equipment is the biggest word and takeaway there, but you think about essential corporate purpose, and ECP just means it is essential to running your city. These are essential items that you have to have, or that you as a council should be able to vote on without an election to be able to run your city. General corporate purposes are things like swimming pools, libraries, housing your police and fire by city halls, renovations and new builds. So anything general that it would be great. We think it's very important to running your city, but the legislature said it's not essential. Those are items that could warrant you to go out for an election. House File 718 did give a boost to what we call a reverse referendum hearing. So if you're a population under 5,000, you have 520,000, 5,000 to 75,000 is 910, and then over 75,000, you get 1.3. And what this means is, if let's say I'm gonna remodel City Hall, and it's gonna cost me $500,000 to do that. Remodeling City Hall is a general corporate purpose. I really don't want to go out to a bond referendum. So what I decided is we will try this reverse referendum hearing. You draw up documents, you hold the public hearing, but citizens can stop you at that public hearing and force you to either abandon the borrowing or force you to go to an election. And they have to have 10% of the voters who voted in your last general election. So this is a big general election year, right? Because it's November, it's presidential. So we do have a couple of cities that are going to do the reverse referendum shortly after the November election, because there will be a higher number of people who voted. So the number that would have to stop them with a petition would also be higher. To be very honest, reverse referendum public hearings usually pass. Usually cities know if they're super controversial, they're not going to even try it at a hearing. They're just going to go to the referendum. If it's something like, again, we've got to add a security door to the front of City Hall, and it's going to cost us 500,000. Cities are like, yep, we're just going to try it with the reverse referendum. And again, I would say in my world, like 85 to 90% of those pass. So talk a little bit about revenue bonds. Revenue bonds can be issued for your like water, sewer, utility, your local option sales tax, or against your local option, and they can be issued for TIF. A revenue bond is a revenue bond. So a lot of times I want to go back. General obligation bonds can be issued and abated. The payment can be abated with TIF revenue, which is pretty common. But there are some projects that do declare and need to have TIF revenue bonds. They are payable only from the revenues of the utility system. They have a higher cost of issuance. You can issue them for up to 30 years in the state of Iowa, and they're going to have higher interest rates because why? They're a revenue-based bond. They're not full faith and credit of the city. They're not a property tax bond. Public hearings are needed for approval. There are no referendums needed to issue the bonds. Now, when you're talking about setting up local option sales tax, right, or renewing it, obviously that is a vote of your people. There are constraints against Revenue bonds, and these are constraints in the issuance. Usually, a revenue bond has to have a debt service reserve fund. And we just call that a test of three. We've got 10% of par, 100% of max annual debt, or 125% of annual average debt service. People say, well, why is there gotta be a reserve fund? Well, it's revenue debt, right? You may, and this was my example the other day, and it actually came to fruition with a city that I was talking to. You know, you think everybody's paying their water and sewer debt. You all work at a city, you know that's not true. Not everybody's paying their water and sewer debt on time. So you're banking on them making their payments to you so that you can pay your debt, right? So that coverage, that debt service reserve fund is just there as just in case something happens. My example is, I have two examples. You know, the little old lady passes away, and all of a sudden her family realizes, oh, she needs to pay her water and sewer bill, and she's been dead for 3 months, right? And all of a sudden they walk in, they pay her water and sewer bill, paying the minimum, obviously, but it kind of gets lost in the shuffle. The other reason you have reserve funds is, you know, we represent cities like the city of Parkersburg, and when half of your city blows away in a tornado, you still have the same expenses, but your revenues are going to drop off, because if there are not houses there, you cannot charge them for water and sewer because you're not providing them with water and sewer. There's also an additional bonds test to revenue debt, and that just basically means you must bring in enough revenue to not only cover your debt payments, your operations, and still have some left over. Again, another cushion, so that, you know, there's enough money there at the end of the day. Operating and maintenance funds are also usually required with revenue debt. So if you ever look through your revenue debt loan agreements, they will say you've got to set up operation and maintenance, and they tell you how much has got to be in those funds as well. State revolving fund is a very popular way for cities in the state of Iowa to issue revenue debt, especially for water and sewer projects. So we've got the Iowa Finance Authority out there. We give you some details over there. The SRF does offer a planning and design loan at for up to 3 years at 0%. It's a great loan. Even if you're not sure the SRF will be your final financing mechanism, if you're looking at USDA, if you're looking at a combination of USDA and some grants and SRF, the 0% is a great way. What it really does is it gives you money back. You're paying your engineers. You want to get that money back in, because right now, especially, you're making some interest income. So I always say the planning and design loan is a great use. The current interest rate for the SRF program is 2.61 with a 0.25% annual administration fee. So effectively, that's a 2.86 interest rate. There is now a change to that SRF rate. It will move quarterly. So October 1st, there will be a new interest rate. You will lock in your interest rate when you have made application with a construction loan. So whatever quarter you're in, when your construction starts and your loan goes through, that is when you will lock in. It will still then be a fixed interest rate for the 20 years or however long you borrow, but it will be ever changing. It is tied to a GO municipal market index. We assume that with the interest rates going down by the Federal Reserve, that rate may get a little sweeter. At 2.86, maybe it drops in the 2.7 range. We think somewhere in the 2.7s maybe next, because we've got 5 days here left, and it's the average of the last 30 days. SRF loans can be both revenue and general obligation. It can be a combination of both. So if you don't want to raise all of your rates to meet the SRF standards, you could issue some as GO and pay that with property taxes or other funds. No debt service reserve fund, as we talked on the last page, there's none of that required for the SRF. The SRF does require Davis-Bacon, which is prevailing wage rate, by American Steel. And now their newest one is also that rate ordinances have to be approved and in place for you to close on a construction loan. That's not a big deal. Basically, it means you really got to do your work ahead of time so that when the bid documents come through, you award the bid. We know it's going to be a couple of months before you're getting a bill to be paid from that contractor. And sometimes if you're bidding in the fall, it's even the springtime. But we also remind you that rate increases in sewer and water rates probably are gonna go to 3 readings, right? Because most councils are like, ooh, we gotta make sure everybody in the city knows that we've gotta raise rates. And so, there can be a little bit of a lag now that ordinance has to be fully approved and in place prior to you being able to close. The SRF reimburses frequently, so there's no interim financing used with the SRF loans, and the revenue coverage factor is a 110. And I put that in there, so operating revenues minus operating expenses equals net revenues, and that must be 110% of the debt payment that you're making with the SRF. So now let's talk a little bit about capital improvement planning. I like this slide because it's got pictures of sticky notes. That in my world is capital improvement planning. The best capital improvement planning happens on a dry erase board or happens on sticky notes that get moved around. It does not have to be intense. Capital improvement planning can be in the most simplistic form of making lists and doing that, you know, with paper and pen. Capital improvement planning is the best tool that your city can use to confront a shrinking budget and shrinking revenues. And we know, again, from House File 718, that is what is coming. And so we definitely want to make sure that you are planning. Planning also keeps your city, I say, afloat with regards to your fund balances, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But you want to plan. You don't ever want to be in a situation where you're like, well, you know, we don't have a plan in place and we're not going, you know, we think everything's going to be fine. And then 5 years down the road, you are totally upside down. Simple capital improvement planning, or CIP. As simple as it comes, you're going to hold meetings with your council, your departments, maybe your department heads, and citizens. Don't ever exclude citizens, because citizens can have very good ideas about things, right? Like you're sitting in your office, but they're maybe out viewing different things, and maybe they're your biggest enemy, but also they can have some pretty good ideas as to what needs to happen. You need to make lists into 3 categories. What are immediate needs? What are future needs? And then what are wants and wishes? And in future needs, you kind of know those things. Those could be big things like, we need a new lagoon system. We need a new water tower. We need a water storage reservoir of some sort, or a new well. Then you're going to work through those lists for now, future, and set that plan for 3 to 5 years. I would say 3 years is a very minimum. 5 years is probably what we see most often being done in capital improvement planning. And then again, once you sort of get these wants, these needs organized, then that's when you start to identify the funding sources, which might slim down the wishes list, right? Like if I want something, but we really don't have the money to pay for it, we can't find where that money's gonna come in the next 3 to 5 years, that might eliminate that, or it might say, hey, we've got to put that in the category where it's 100% fundraising, right? We got to go out on the fundraising campaign, got to put somebody in charge of that and get that done. I think about splash pads in communities that don't have swimming pools. A lot of times that's, you know, you think it's a need, it ends up being a want. Cities say we can't finance it or finance all of it. So if you can do some fundraising, we'll try to help out the end. You also need to outline cash and borrowing needs. So a capital improvements plan, although my job is for you to issue debt, right? Like that's what I do primarily in my job. I don't want you to issue debt for all of your capital improvement plan. You shouldn't be. You should be identifying what can be paid for with cash and what items do need to be borrowed for, and why they need to be borrowed. Maybe it's you need to borrow because it's a $400,000 project that you want to pay with local option sales tax, but you don't have $400,000 sitting in receipts right now. So you're going to borrow for it and leverage that local option sales tax into the future. So over 10 years, you're going to use 40, 50, 60,000 of local option a year to pay that debt off so you can get the project done right now. The plan needs to be reviewed annually and adjusted for projects that have been completed or moved to a different year. And additions, right? Things happen. Something comes up and you're like, oh, now we gotta put this into the plan, but hey, that bridge that we talked about, the inspector came out and said, it's good for another 4 years. We can push that bridge down in the plan a little bit longer, or we've decided to go out and ask for some federal funding on that bridge, and that we know if we get it, it's gonna be 3 years down the road before we can construct that bridge. So there's things like that, and then follow the plan to your best of your ability. I also wanna talk about this. Following the plan means you've put everything into the plan. If you are a small community, buying new laptops for everybody in City Hall and buying tablets for the council, that's a big expense, right? That should be in the plan. Technology is expensive anymore, and those need to be in the plan. You don't think of them as like, well, it's not a capital improvement, but it is a capital improvement. It might be things within City Hall, it might be things at the fire station. But I mean, ultimately, people think roads, bridges, streets, they're talking about, swimming pools. But it's all these other things. It's the skid loader that's needed for public works that I think we just saw one come across my desk for about $113,000 with all the attachments. And I was like, oh my goodness. And so, I mean, it's those things that all should be on that list. And again, that's why there's that wants and that needs list, and you move things around. I wrote, there are companies and COGs and local universities and colleges that can assist you with capital improvements planning. We get asked all the time if we assist with that. We unfortunately do not. I would love to, and maybe in retirement, that'll be something that I can tackle, because I love the idea of it. And we get involved at the funding source part of it. Like the cities put together and say, this is what we think. Can you help us run numbers now to see what we can afford and what we can finance? And that's what we get involved. But the other thing I want to say, and I think I said this a couple weeks ago when we had this class, again, as a smaller community, you don't need to be issuing debt every single year. So in your capital improvements plan, it might be that every third year, there's a big project that you can't afford with cash. And every third year, you're going to do a borrowing and include a couple projects. So that may help you identify where on the list those projects need to be. Again, I just don't think as a smaller community, you need to issue debt every year. So it might be year one with cash, year two with cash, year three, big projects, pay it with debt. Year four, year five with cash, year six, big projects, pay it with debt. I think that is a good plan for you to get into if possible. Again, we know things move around, but to have a plan like that, I think is always good as well.
Hey Maggie, this is Dawn Smith. I got a question for you while we're here. We're doing a lot of different projects, and I guess one of my concerns is, and this goes back to legislation like 718. How do we plan for this? I mean, we're planning on these revenues coming in, and then all of a sudden they're getting cut. How can you take the debt service on if you don't know if you can even pay for the other stuff that you have to do daily, like wages and insurance and all that fun stuff?
Right. And I'm going to say this, that idea that you just mentioned on the debt service levy is something that is kind of of interest. If Ted Nielsen was on this call, he'd tell me, Maggie, just shut up right now, because that's not what was intended. But I want to tell you that, as your budget's getting constrained, they're constraining your 810, right? So what we're finding is people are rolling all their benefits out, or maybe they weren't rolling all their benefits out. Now they're rolling all their benefits out. And if there were things that were being paid with local option sales tax, those items that were being paid maybe with local option sales tax, and local option sales tax could offset something else, folks aren't paying those with local option anymore, those debt payments. They're paying those with debt service levy. So where the legislature said, we're going to reduce the amount that you can tax your citizens, I honestly don't think that's a possibility. I think that if you allow that reduction to happen, but in my opinion, there's ways that you don't have to allow that reduction to happen, because you can move things around. I have a fair amount of city clerks that tell me they balance the tax rate with debt service levy at the very end of their budget. They do the rest of their budget, and then they look at where their tax rate is, and if it's lower than where it was last year, and they're abating some of those property tax dollars, in their debt service with other funds, they start reducing those other funds, so it brings their property tax levy right back up to where it should have been. So, if you were at a $12 levy and you let that levy go to $11 because it's House File 718, that's okay. But you might have had an opportunity, or you still have an opportunity, to let it not go down as much. And again, roll out those benefits, do that debt service levy. Now, I will tell you that in the past, when things like that have happened with a big change, and let's say 3 years from now, they say, well, we're gonna start limiting the debt service levy. And you're gonna have a dollar limitation that you can levy. There will be class action lawsuits against the state unless they grandfather in the debt that you have existing. So it might be that going forward, your debt will be limited once the existing debt is paid off and you get yourself to a point and you might have to limit your new issuances. But we feel pretty confident in the fact that, that debt service levy, if you issue debt now and use a levy, you're gonna be able to pay for it with that levy in the future, even if they start to make some restrictions. Did that answer your question?
It does. I'm just really concerned because a lot of times we're using
yeah.
local option sales tax to kind of balance the budget and in different places. And that worries me if they come in and all of a sudden they're starting to mess around with sales tax too.
Yes,
And
it worries us, and that's where I will plug, talk to your legislators. When the League of Cities, if this comes up, and we're sure it's going to, when the League of Cities says, please send a letter, please send a letter. Please send the letters that say, do not mess with our local option sales tax. In my opinion, local option sales tax is what? Locally controlled. It is what your city needs, and working across the state, every city has different needs for those dollars. And we see it from anywhere from 100% roads to 100% property tax relief to funding the Economic Development Corporation, so that they can do some marketing of housing and things like that. Every city has to decide, and those voters should get to decide on what those dollars and how those dollars should be spent. So I am definitely not in favor of the state taking over the local option sales tax. And I'm sure that is a fight that will rise again.
well, it goes back to local control, so.
Yeah, right, absolutely. So we'll talk a little bit about budget constraints here. The problem, general fund levy constraints, again, we were just kind of talking about this, kind of a good segue here. Roll out all of your expenses for employee benefits, insurance, capital improves reserve levy. I do believe you have to vote this in, but you can put a capital improvements reserve levy in. I would think it's 75 cents, possibly, and it has to be voted, but that is a way that cities in the future may have to vote in something like that. Again, it is a property tax and your citizens may or may not, but if you start to squeeze and you start not mowing their parks and you have to close down the swimming pool because there's not enough money and you have to close this and that, that's when voters may say, well, yeah, we know that, these dollars could help make these improvements that we're not getting done right now. One of the problems we see, we can't keep a city clerk or a public works employee, and we say share services with another city. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but especially smaller communities, we're seeing some of those shared services being very important. We're seeing them really at the school district level, and I'm sure you're all aware of that, but we're seeing shared people like IT people being shared between two school districts. And that's because our IT people are getting paid a lot of money, right? They're running all of the technology of the school. And those school districts can't afford to each have an IT person when the school districts are 15 miles apart. So we're seeing them do that too. What was that?
I'm seeing transportation too.
Transportation, correct. Shared superintendents. I mean, we're seeing all of that administrative grouping. We're seeing some shared finance directors at school district levels. And so, that it's not, again, everybody's favorite form, but we've also found there is a lack of interest to serve, at the city clerk level and at the finance director level. And so sometimes that's, one of your best options is how can we finance or how can we share and then utilize the other people that we can hire, maybe at a little lot less cost because maybe they're only coming in part-time, things like that. And then, we need to bring in more dollars into the city for funding. One of the ways that we talk about is, do you charge a hotel motel tax? If you have a hotel motel in your community and you have charged franchise fees. Again, this negates the entire plan of House File 718, right? To lower taxes and to lower fees. But we all know that in the job that you do, that is hard to do without cutting services. And so we have a fair amount of cities that have a franchise fee, and it was 1 or 2%. And in the last 12 months, they've changed that to 2 or 3%. You can go up to the 5% mark. We have a few cities that are at the 5%, but we have some cities that have also implemented a franchise fee on that, their gas, electric, because they know they've got to spend those dollars somewhere else because they've got some budget constraints. So we talked a lot about House File 718. It's just like a bad word, it's a bad word. But here are some of the things that came out of it. There are those general fund and levy limitations. You all know these top 3 or 4 bullet points. 2029 and beyond is supposed to give you back your 810. We'll see if that happens. Using a city's growth and valuation to limit the amount of property tax dollars that you can collect. That's kind of the basis of it. Let's see here. Budget forms, auto-calculate. I don't know if the budget forms seem to be easier. They're supposed to be easier, but I think, this is supposed to be working through it. Your max levy hearing is gone, but it's replaced with that new hearing. That has to be done at a standalone meeting. Now, I want to remind everybody that standalone meeting can happen 15 minutes before your other meeting. So please don't think it's got to happen on 2 different nights, because it does not. It can say 5 to 5:15 is the hearing meeting, and then at 5:15 we'll adjourn, and at 5:20 we're going to start our regular meeting. So just FYI on that. March 5th is your deadline now to report to the county. So I underlined March 5th. I put in red, this is 10 days sooner than last year. Counties are telling us everybody had it in by March 5th, but I want to remind you, last year's deadline was March 15th. So if you were that straggler city not getting your stuff in to the county till March 15th, you have to have it to them by March 5th. And that's that statement where it tells you how many debt dollars you'll have that you're going to levy in the debt service, so that they can put out the postcard to the citizens that says this is what, your ultimate property tax levy dollars are going towards, and what, you're going to look at. Now, I do this for a living. My dad did this for a living, and my sister walks in and she looks at me and she goes, "What is this postcard?" And I was like, she had no idea. She's like, "I've read it 3 times. This is what I do for a living." And she's like, "I have no idea." So nobody knows what those, unless you're in the know, they are very hard to
On top of that,
understand.
why would they put in TIF stuff? And that confuse people even more.
Yeah.
Look at all this money.
Exactly. So just remember that's 10 days sooner than last year. So other notes from House File 718. If you have commercial property revitalization, which is tax exemption, basically, tax abatement, now there's minimum assessment agreements that have to be signed. So tax abatement on commercial requires minimum assessment agreements. The school district portion of the tax levy has now been removed from abatement for residential properties. So if I am telling someone I'm going to abate their taxes for their residential house, I no longer can abate the school district's levy. I can only abate the city and the county's levy, which is, it's quite a big difference there for those residential homes. There's that homestead exemption now for those over 65. It's not big, but it's something, right? So you'll probably see a little bit more homestead exemption coming out. Increase in military property tax credit and exemption. Your annual financial reports now require a little bit more information on debts outstanding and what debts you have outstanding. And then the GO bond election dates are limited to those November elections only. So that's, again, we've been through that a couple of times now. Enterprise funds and special revenue funds, we're going to talk a little bit about. So your enterprise funds, they account for the operations that they're similar to a business. So that's why they're called enterprise. They're like a business fund. Basically, you run your water, your sewer, if you have storm water, electric, or gas, you run it like a business, right? There's revenues in from what you charge people, you pay the expenses out, and it needs to stay above board, right? There should be breaking even. If you're not breaking even, you need to raise rates immediately. Rates and charges have to be reviewed annually by the city, and they need to adjust so that at the very least, you're breaking even. I go into cities all the time to talk about water and sewer projects, and councils are very proud to tell me they haven't raised rates since 1995. And I'm like, well, that's gonna be a problem then, because I mean, you're at that point in time probably looking at 150% rate increase. And depending on the size of the project, and depending on how much, you know, your average bill for one of those utility systems, water or sewer is, 150% could be big, and it might not be as big, right? I had a small city out in western Iowa, and the minimum bill for sewer was $15 a month. And I had to tell them they had to raise rates 180%. 180% doesn't even take them to $45 a month, right? It was a big jump, but it's not a $200 a month bill. It was a $45 a month bill. Planning for future projects, small or large, need to be accounted for in those annual rate increases. We've got some cities who are planning for some very large sewer projects, and they're doing a 4-year increase because they know in about year 3 or 4 that project has to happen, and they're kind of ramping up their rates now. Why do I like that? You like that because that builds cash balance. Cash balance is important when you've got a big project coming up. Again, you don't want to borrow for everything. You want to have some cash. You want to have some grants if available. You want all these things that could help you pay for that project so you borrow less money. And then what we always say is June 30th fund balances, and that's when you should look at those fund balances, is June 30th. Compare June 30th to June 30th, because that's truly when all revenues are in, all expenses are out. But that June 30th fund balance in your water, sewer, storm should be no less than 25% of your annual revenues and or expenses, but could be as high as 100% for small communities. I spoke to a community yesterday. Their annual expense budget in their sewer is about $350,000. She's sitting on about $300,000 in cash right now in her fund balance as of June 30th. And she says, we feel pretty comfortable about that. And then she said, but in the water, we're only sitting at like $84,000 out of a $400,000 expense budget. And she said, so I've told them that we've got to raise rates because they want to do a well rehab, and the well rehab is going to be like $250,000. And she's like, and that's happening in 2 years, and I don't have the money, like we don't have the cash for that. We don't really want to borrow for it. So that's why it's important to look at that amount and to try to keep anywhere between that 25 and 100%. The other thing is more cash balance leads to helping with your capital improvements fund, right? If you got to buy that skid loader and you are going to use it for water, sewer, and streets, you could take $30,000, $30,000, $30,000 and buy your $90,000 skid loader. Take them from these different departments where there's some cash balance. Doesn't have to all come from one, could come from multiples, but at least you've got the cash there. So again, I think our biggest takeaway here is just keep looking at those balances every year. Special revenue funds like road use, local option, TIF, employee benefits. City councils should have policies or plans for the expenditures of those funds. You don't have to have maybe a formal policy, but you should discuss it as a council, like as what we're going to spend those funds on. A lot of times road use is being spent on employees, and we understand that. But as as the gas tax increased, we encouraged people not to spend it on employees. Take that money, set it aside, whatever that bump was gonna be for you, and use that towards road projects. Use it towards,
Your street plan.
use it, yeah, exactly. Use it towards that skid loader purchase, whatever that might be. As those funds grow in annual collections, you wanna try to identify new ways to save or spend those. Now, this is where I don't have anything up here that says 25 to 100%, because honestly, these could be funds that are in and out every year. Sometimes you're saving those funds to pay for something big, but that's again, drawing us back to capital improvement planning. I mean, it's important that we understand we can't over leverage these funds, right? If I take in 100,000 in local option sales tax And we're not spending that right now on anything, but we really don't have a cash balance in that fund right now because we've sort of spent it in the past. I can only leverage that 100,000 a year in my capital improvements plan, right? I can't say, oh, well, every year I'm gonna spend 200,000 in local options. I don't have 200,000 to spend. And so it is important that, you know, as you do that capital improvements planning, you're looking at how you're leveraging those dollars. Should you be building up cash for that project that's 5 years down the road, things like that. And I know that sometimes I'm preaching to the choir when I'm telling city clerks this, because it is your council's decision ultimately, but that's why it's important to have these conversations with council and share these types of things with them, because it really does fall on them to make those decisions. And I know that they're sitting on your council to make good decisions for the city, right? Like they want the city to succeed in the future. So let's talk a little bit about cash balances. We're just a couple slides away here from the end. So some best practices for your cash balances are that you're reviewing that again every June 30th. You're setting fund balance policies or annual carryover amounts. So you're saying we're gonna have that 25, we're gonna have that 40%. I think you really set that based on how many dollars that is. Some small cities that, you know, 25% might only be $30,000. $30,000 doesn't buy you a lot, right? When something goes bad. And so they may say, yeah, we've got to have 100% of cash balance practice. Fiscal year, again, having that 25 to 100% of annual revenues. Smaller communities may need even more than 100%. It may just be that they, you know, based on what they think their needs are. Also, you can be building up cash balances with the idea that you're going to spend that cash balance in the future. But again, that's something I kind of tell the clerks and finance people, you need to be reminding the council of that. Like when they're looking at big balances, because councils like to spend money. We all like to spend money, right? If we all saw money in our checking account, we'd like, I'm gonna go get some new shoes. Like that's what I would say. But I mean, you all like to spend it. So it's very important that every few months when you're showing them that cash balances report, when you're showing them that balance sheet, you're reminding them, you know, like in a footnote, like the reason we have a large local option sales tax balance is 2 years from now, we're planning to buy this. Or the reason we've got this large balance in water is because we'd like to pay for the water tower painting with cash in 2 years. So it's important to do that. Provide your council with monthly or quarterly updates to those cash balances, just sort of what I was talking about. Building up cash balances for projects and purchases. And then avoid spending those cash balances on operational costs. If you have to spend cash balance on operational costs 1 month, the next month you better be implementing a rate increase, because then you've gotten yourself into a hole, and that hole gets deeper and deeper and deeper every single month. And all of a sudden you're out of cash. I have a city that gave me some information and they're like, our cash balance in the water is negative. And I'm like, how? And they're like, it's negative. And I'm like, how? And they're like, oh, it's been negative for many, many years. And I'm like, no, that's like, that is a no-no. You've got to raise rates. And then ladder investments for different sources of money within the city so that they're becoming available at different times. I'm not an investment advisor, but there's money to be made on investments right now, right? For 15 years, we didn't make any money on investments. Now there's money to be made, but I remind you, the state says you can't invest as a city for over 397 days. So that's 13 months. That is a policy of the state. That is in the state investment policy, because you are investing dollars that aren't yours. They're property tax dollars. There's dollars of your citizens. So, but you need to ladder those, have something coming due in 3 months, have something coming due in 6 months, 9 months, just because then you have cash available when cash is needed to be available. And then just to end it up here, before we kind of close things out, these are comments that I hear. You know, we budgeted for a new skid loader. The old one is still working. Do we have to get one this year? And I always say, don't spend money if you don't have to. A budget is a budget, right? A budget's just like an idea of what we're gonna do. And really budgeting is important for the expenses. So if you don't have to spend on the cash on the skid loader, let that cash carry over, because that's just money you're not spending out of those revenue dollars, and let that carry over. We have We talked with the community and the public works guy did not understand budgeting and he admitted to it. He ran out, there was $5,000 left in his budget. And he ran out and bought all kinds of stuff. And he's like, well, I wanted to hit the mark on my budget. And we're like, well, did you need, 47 rolls of, paper towels? He's like, no. And he's like, but I thought I had to spend the budget or you were gonna take it away from me next year. And we're like, that's not how it works. It's just, you came in less, right? You spent less money and that's good because it added to the fund balance. So make sure that everybody working at the city understands that concept as well. We continue to draw general fund balance down annually to pay operational expenses for running the city. And then your attempt is lessen operational costs, look to share certain costs amongst utility funds, if those can be partially attributable. So, if your city clerk is only being paid out of the general fund, but she's also, or he's also doing the utility billing, make sure that you're charging off some time to that utility fund. What will that do? Probably raise your utility rates, but that's operationally, if they're utilizing time on that utility, they should be paid accordingly from that utility. So something to think about there. And then we know we have a new water tower project that's coming in 3 years, but the council wants to wait and not raise rates until they have an exact cost. I just say no to that. I just am like, no, we have to start now. Especially if we're just breaking even or we don't have a big cash balance. The reason for that is if you start to anticipate, and it's not that you have to raise rates all the way, right? All the way to what we think it's gonna be. You just need to start with some incremental rate increases. Every dollar that you bring in, an extra money, an extra revenue, that's not being spent out because we don't have the project yet, is money that can be spent on the project. So we do not have to borrow as much. And people always say, well, if I don't borrow as much, it's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal because if you don't borrow, if you have $100,000 in cash over a 20-year loan, you understand that's $5,000 a year just in principle that you've reduced that borrowing by using that cash. That's a big deal. And when we talk about like revenue-based loans, water and sewer loans, $5,000 a year plus probably a little accrued interest might mean the difference between a 20% increase in your user rates and a 15% increase in your user rates, which can be very important. So again, starting those rate increases ahead of a project, getting a healthy cash balance in that fund ahead of a project is very, very important. So with that, that's all that I have. I did that in record time because I did it nighttime. I want you all to get out of here. I did that. So if you have questions, you can always reach out. That's my office number, my mobile number. There's my email. We're happy to have a discussion about this. I believe you've been or you will be emailed this presentation as well. Again, I would encourage you, if you are not a council person or if you are, to share it with the council and have them, even sit through some budget sessions that like the League of Cities puts on this fall. When your COG does local things, you definitely want to get everybody involved if you can.
Yep, and we'll be sending the recording out as well.
Perfect.
So it'll be posted on our website.
Yeah.
So anybody can watch it.
I appreciate everybody's time tonight. Thank you.
Thanks,
you.
Maggie.
Any other questions? All
Oh, I have
right.
lots of questions.
Always lots of questions. Any that you want to talk about in an open forum?
Anything you wanted to ask, Dawn?
Maybe she
Yep.
wanted out or botched it.
All right. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, we'll stop the recording and